The woman who would be called Alara stood on a street that was not a street but a suggestion of one. A wide, rutted track of pale dust baked hard by a sun that offered light but no warmth, only a kind of relentless pressure. She held a letter in one hand, its paper softened and creased from 1,000 nervous foldings and unfoldings in the dark belly of a ship. The ink a faded map to a life that was supposed to have been waiting for her here, at the end of the world. The letter spoke of a respectable merchant husband and a house with glass windows, of a town called Providence, where opportunity was as plentiful as the timber on the hills. But the sign nailed crookedly to a post before her read "Provisional," in stark, sun-bleached letters, a correction that felt less like a clerical error and more like a judgment. The town itself was a scattering of raw lumber buildings that hunched against the wind, their faces blank and unpainted, their windows empty as vacant eyes, and the silence between them was not peaceful, but watchful, the silence of a place that has seen too many hopefuls arrive and too many broken people leave. A gust of wind, sharp and cold despite the sun, lifted a fine layer of grit from the ground and threw it against her face, a rough, unwelcome kiss, and she tasted the land in it, the taste of endings, not beginnings. The promise was already ash in her mouth. She had crossed an ocean for a lie. The knowledge did not crash down on her, but seeped in slowly, a cold tide rising in her veins, chilling her from the inside out. The people who passed, a handful of men with faces weathered like old leather, and women whose gazes slid past her as if she were a ghost, did not look like citizens of a thriving Providence. They looked like survivors. They moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, as if conserving some vital, unnameable energy against the vast, indifferent landscape that surrounded them on all sides. She lowered her hand, the letter crumpling in her fist, its promises turning to nonsense. There was no fine merchant here, waiting for her with a smile and a key to a new life. There was only the dust, and the wind, and the cold, a praising stare of a man leaning against the doorway of the largest building, the one marked General Store and Mercantile. He was watching her, not with curiosity, but with a flat, possessive assessment, the way a man might look at a horse he was considering buying, checking its teeth and its legs for weakness. He was a man in a clean coat, his face smooth where the others were lined, and she knew, with a certainty that was as hollow and vast as the sky above, that this was Finch. This was the author of the lie. He pushed himself off the doorframe and began to walk toward her, his boots making no sound in the thick dust, and with each step he took, the world she had imagined for herself disintegrated a little more, leaving her stranded in the harsh, unforgiving glare of the real one. Afternoon. The sun had begun its long, slow descent, painting the underside of the clouds in bruised shades of orange and purple, but the heat of the day still clung to the earth. Miles from the cynical correction of Provisional, Silas Blackwood moved along his northern fence line, his steps measured and even, his focus narrowed to the task at hand. He worked with a quiet, practiced competence that was its own kind of language, a conversation he held with the land, the wire, and the wood. His hands, gloved in worn leather, were broad and calloused, instruments shaped by a lifetime of this same deliberate labor, of gripping post hole diggers and stretching wire taut until it hummed with tension. He found a loose post, its base rotted by a winter's worth of damp, and he did not sigh or curse the extra work. He simply set down his tools and began the process of replacing it. He dug the old post out, his shoulders and back working in a smooth, powerful rhythm, the shovel biting into the hard-packed soil with a satisfying crunch. The world for Silas was a series of such tasks, a litany of small, necessary repairs that kept chaos at bay. His ranch was an island of order in a sea of wildness. Its boundaries marked by these fences he so diligently maintained, and his solitude was not a loneliness, but a state of equilibrium, a peace he had carefully constructed for himself, by keeping the noise of the world at a comfortable distance. He finished setting the new post, tamping the earth around it until it stood firm and unyielding, a sentinel against the encroaching wilderness and the passage of time. He paused, pulling off a glove to wipe a line of sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist, and in that moment of stillness, he surveyed his domain. The grasslands rolled away from him in waves of gold and green, dotted with the dark shapes of his cattle grazing peacefully. His house, a low, sturdy structure of stone and timber, sat nestled in a shallow valley, smoke curling from its chimney in a thin gray ribbon. It was a simple life, unadorned and demanding, but it was his. It was a truth he could put his hands on, a reality as solid as the rock beneath his feet. He had little use for promises or the flowery language of hope. He dealt in the currency of what was real, what was tangible, What could be mended or built or defended with his own two hands? He did not know that this carefully balanced world was about to be disturbed, that a piece of the world's chaos, a woman with eyes the color of a stormy sea and a crumpled letter full of lies, was at that very moment being cast out into the wilderness that bordered his own, a stone tossed into the placid surface of his quiet life. He only knew that the air was growing colder, and the sky to the west was darkening with the bruised purple of an approaching storm, and it was time to head home. The conversation with Finch had been brief, brutal, and conducted in a tone of chilling politeness. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His power was in the cold, transactional nature of his cruelty. A terrible shame, he had said, referring to the supposed death of his brother, the man Alara was meant to marry. He was a good man, a tragic loss. Finch's eyes, small and dark, held no trace of grief, only a flat, reptilian blankness. He explained the situation as a simple matter of accounting. Her passage had been paid for, an investment. Since the original arrangement was now void, she would have to work off the debt. He gestured vaguely toward the back of the mercantile. I can offer you a position, mending, cleaning. It will take some time, of course. Several years, I should think. It was not an offer. It was a sentence. She looked from his smooth, untroubled face to the dust-caked windows of his store, and she saw the truth of her new cage. The lie had brought her here, but a different kind of trap was being set. No, she said. The word was small, barely a whisper, but it was all she had left. It was a stone she threw against the wall of his indifference. Finch's thin smile did not falter. He seemed almost amused by her defiance, as if a kitten had tried to hiss at him. I'm afraid you misunderstand, he said, his voice still maddeningly calm. This is not a negotiation. You are indebted to me. It is a matter of contract. He held out a hand, as if expecting her to simply acquiesce, to place her future in his palm. She stared at it, then met his gaze. And for the first time since stepping off the boat, the fear that had been a cold knot in her stomach hardened into something else, something sharp, something that would not break. She said nothing more, merely held his gaze until he, with a slight irritated shrug, let his hand drop. As you wish, he said, the politeness now laced with a thin, sharp edge of contempt. But Providence is not a charitable institution. You will find the world outside this town is unforgiving. He turned and walked back to his store, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the dusty track as the first drops of a cold rain began to fall, each one landing in the dust like a dark, spreading stain. She was free of his immediate claim, but she was also utterly alone, with no money, no shelter, and nowhere to go as the sky opened up and the rain began to fall in earnest, turning the dust to a slick, clinging mud. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and began to walk, her destination unknown, moving away from the hollow promise of provisional and into the vast, darkening emptiness of the land beyond. That night, the storm broke with a fury that seemed personal, the wind screaming like a living thing, and the rain coming down in solid, blinding sheets. Alara stumbled through the darkness, guided only by the intermittent, terrifying flashes of lightning that lit up the landscape in stark, monochrome detail. She had left the faint lights of the town far behind, driven by an instinct to put as much distance as possible between herself and Finch's cold smile. The ground was treacherous, a sucking mire of mud that pulled at her worn shoes, and the cold had seeped deep into her bones. A damp, shaking misery. She was on the verge of collapse, of simply lying down in the mud and letting the storm have her, when a flash of lightning revealed a dark, low shape against the horizon, a structure of some kind. Hope, or something like it, gave her a final burst of strength, and she staggered toward it, her hands outstretched in the darkness. It was a small, dilapidated line shack, a relic from some forgotten survey or boundary dispute, its door hanging crookedly from a single hinge. It was not much, but it was shelter. She pushed her way inside, out of the driving rain, and collapsed onto the dirt floor, shivering uncontrollably in the damp, musty darkness. The world narrowed to the sound of her own chattering teeth and the drumming of the rain on the leaky roof. She had escaped one cage only to find herself in another, smaller one, a prisoner of the storm, and her own desperation. Silas found her the next morning. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and glistening, the air sharp and smelling of wet earth and sage. He had ridden out to check on a section of fence near the creek, knowing the storm could have brought down trees or caused a washout. He saw the shack from a distance and noted that the door, which was usually shut, was ajar. He approached with caution, his instincts honed by years of solitude, every sense alert to the disturbance in his routine. He dismounted quietly, his horse blowing softly through its nostrils, and moved to the doorway. He peered into the gloom, his eyes taking a moment to adjust, and saw her. A huddled shape on the floor, wrapped in a threadbare shawl, her hair matted with mud, and her face pale and drawn in the faint light. She was asleep, or perhaps unconscious, her breathing shallow. He stood there for a long moment, a silent, still figure in the doorway, his mind a blank slate. He had not had a visitor on his land in years, let alone one who appeared to have been washed up by a storm like a piece of driftwood. His first instinct, the one that had kept him safe and solitary for so long, was to close the door and ride away, to pretend he had seen nothing. It was not his problem. The world and its troubles were not his concern. But then she stirred, a small, involuntary shiver running through her, and a low sound, a soft moan of misery, escaped her lips. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated suffering, and it pierced the carefully constructed walls of his detachment. It was a problem, and it was on his land. That made it his. He did not wake her. He rode back to his house, his mind working slowly, deliberately, processing this new and unwelcome variable. He returned a short time later on foot, carrying a blanket and a tin bowl of stew, still warm from the stove. He entered the shack and knelt beside her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse. It was louder than he intended. Her eyes flew open, wide with a wild, cornered fear. She scrambled backward, pushing herself against the far wall of the shack, her body tense and ready to flee. He saw the terror in her face and held up a hand, palm open, a gesture of peace. He set the bowl and the blanket on the floor between them and backed away toward the door, giving her space. "The storm," he said, by way of explanation. It was all he could offer. He watched as her gaze flickered from his face to the steaming bowl of stew, her fear warring with a hunger so profound it was visible in the hollows of her cheeks. She did not move, did not speak, her eyes tracking his every motion. He saw the fight in them, the stubborn refusal to show weakness, even now. He understood that. "You can't stay here," he said, his words clipped, practical. He meant the shack, the crumbling structure that offered little more than a pretense of shelter. But he saw in her eyes that she heard it as an eviction, another rejection, another door closing in her face. A flicker of despair crossed her features, so raw and unguarded that he felt it like a physical blow. She made a move to stand, to gather her dignity, and walk back out into the wilderness. And he spoke again, more quickly this time. "The barn," he said, pointing back in the direction of his ranch. "It's dry. There's work, if you want it." He did not wait for an answer. He turned and walked away, leaving the choice to her, a small offering of warmth and a chance left sitting on the cold dirt floor between them. She came. An hour later, as he was forking hay into the mangers, he saw her approaching the barn, a small, solitary figure, moving slowly but steadily across the wet pasture. She carried the empty bowl in one hand and had the blanket draped over her shoulders. She stopped at the wide-open entrance, hesitating on the threshold between the harsh sunlight and the cool, shadowed interior. She looked small and fragile against the vast backdrop of the plains, yet there was a straightness to her spine, a set to her jaw that spoke of an unyielding core. She had eaten the stew. She had accepted the blanket, but she had not been broken by the offering. She had been sustained by it. Silas continued his work, not looking at her directly, giving her time to acclimate, to make her own peace with the space. The barn was his sanctuary, a place of earthy smells, of leather and hay and animal warmth, of quiet, rhythmic work. He knew its every beam and post, the way the light fell through the cracks in the walls at different times of day. Her presence was a foreign element, a note of discord in a familiar song. "The work," she said, her voice quiet but clear, pulling him from his thoughts. He stopped, leaning the pitchfork against a stall. He turned to face her. She stood just inside the doorway now, the light from outside creating a halo around her disheveled hair. Her clothes were still damp and mud-stained, but she had washed her face and hands in the horse trough, a small act of reclamation. "You mentioned work." He nodded, his gaze practical. He was not a man for pleasantries or wasted words. He looked at her hands, which were fine-boned and pale, clearly unused to manual labor, but he also saw the determination in her eyes. "The house," he said, "mending, cooking, the garden needs turning." It was a simple list of tasks, the domestic chores he had long neglected or performed with rough, masculine inefficiency. He was offering her a role, a purpose within his world, but it was a transaction, not an act of charity. He would give her food and shelter, and in return, she would contribute. It was a clear and honest arrangement, the only kind he knew how to make. He expected her to bargain, or to question, or perhaps to weep with gratitude. She did none of these things. She simply gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture of acceptance that was as clipped and unadorned as his own offer. "I can do that," she said. And with those 4 words, a new and uncertain chapter began for the quiet rancher and the woman who had come from across the sea. A silent partnership was formed, not of words, but of shared space and mutual necessity. A fragile truce in the heart of an unforgiving land. Weeks passed, bleeding into a month, and a new rhythm established itself on the Blackwood Ranch, as quiet and steady as a slowly beating heart. Alara moved through the small stone house with a silent efficiency that surprised Silas, transforming the dusty, neglected space into a place of warmth and order. She mended his torn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She coaxed life from the stubborn soil of the garden, and she learned the simple, hearty rhythm of his meals. She worked from sunup to sundown, her movements fueled by a fierce, quiet pride, a determination to earn her keep and prove that she was not a burden. The softness of her hands gradually gave way to the hardness of calluses, each one a small victory, a testament to her resilience. She rarely spoke, and neither did he. Their communication was a language of actions. A hot meal left on the table for him when he came in late from the fields, a stack of freshly chopped firewood he left by the back door for her stove. They orbited each other in the small space of the homestead, 2 solitary planets drawn into an unlikely, unspoken alignment. Silas found himself watching her at odd moments, a strange and unfamiliar curiosity stirring within him. He watched her as she sat on the porch in the evenings, her hands busy with some mending, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where the sun bled its colors across the sky. He wondered what she saw out there, what memories or broken dreams she was looking at. He knew nothing of her past, of the lie that had brought her to this place, and he did not ask. His own past was a locked room, and he respected the locks on the doors of others. Yet, her presence had subtly altered the landscape of his life. The silence in the house was no longer an empty one. It was a shared silence, filled with the quiet sounds of her movements, the soft scratch of a needle through cloth, the gentle clink of a spoon against a bowl. It was a sound he had not realized he had missed until he heard it again. He would find small, unexpected signs of her presence. A wildflower tucked into a glass on the mantelpiece, the neat organization of his tool shed, a subtle reordering of his world that he found he did not mind. He was a man who had built his life on the principle of self-reliance, on the belief that he needed no one. And yet, this woman's quiet competence, her refusal to be cowed by hardship, had found a crack in the armor of his solitude. The world outside the ranch, however, had not forgotten them. One afternoon, as Silas was repairing a harness in the barn, he saw a rider approaching. It was Finch. He sat atop a fine black horse, his clean coat and polished boots a stark contrast to the dust and grime of the working ranch. He was not alone. 2 men flanked him, rough-looking riders with the flat, incurious eyes of men who were paid for their loyalty and not their opinions. Silas set down his tools and walked out of the barn, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. He stopped in the middle of the yard, planting his feet, a quiet and immovable obstacle. Finch reined in his horse a few yards away, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. He had found his missing asset. "Blackwood," Finch said, his voice smooth and pleasant, as if this were a casual social call. "I was just riding the line, checking on my property. Imagine my surprise seeing a familiar face here." He gestured with his chin toward the house, where Alara had appeared in the doorway, a dishcloth in her hand, her face pale. "It seems my lost lamb has found a new shepherd." Silas said nothing. He just watched Finch, his expression unreadable. Finch's smile tightened. He had expected a reaction, perhaps defensiveness or anger. Silas's stillness unnerved him. "There is the small matter of her debt," Finch continued, his tone shifting from feigned pleasantry to cold business. "She has a contract for her passage from the old country, a significant sum. As she is residing on your property, I must assume you are taking responsibility for her obligations." He made it sound like a perfectly reasonable, legalistic matter, a simple collection of a debt. But they both knew it was a claim of ownership. Finch was not here for money, he was here for her. He was here to reassert the power she had defied, to prove that no one, especially not a penniless immigrant girl, could say no to him and get away with it. The 2 hired men shifted in their saddles, their hands resting near the pistols on their hips. They were part of the performance, the silent threat that backed up Finch's polite words. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, with unspoken violence. From the corner of his eye, Silas could see Alara, frozen in the doorway, a small bird facing down 3 circling hawks. He knew, in that moment, that this was not about a fence line or a debt. It was about a choice. The world he had so carefully kept at bay had finally arrived at his doorstep. The sun beat down on the yard, bleaching the color from the sky, and the only sound was the jingle of a bridle and the soft stamp of a restless horse. Finch's words hung in the air, an accusation and a demand. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, a man whose power was built on the quiet compliance of others, on the knowledge that most people would bend to avoid trouble. He looked at Silas, expecting that same predictable calculation, that same weighing of risk versus reward. A lone rancher against 3 men, one of whom held the veneer of law and contract on his side. It was not a fair fight, and Finch knew it. He believed he had already won. He saw Silas as just another piece on the board, a simple man of dirt and cattle who would surely see the logic of stepping aside. "She is my responsibility, Blackwood," Finch said, his voice taking on a harder edge, the politeness finally wearing thin. "A matter of business. Send her out. We'll be on our way, and this unpleasantness can be forgotten." His gaze flickered to the 2 men beside him, a silent reminder of the force he held in reserve. They were blunt instruments, but effective ones. Silas did not look at Finch. His gaze was fixed somewhere over Finch's shoulder, on the distant line of the hills, as if he were judging the weather or counting the clouds. He seemed utterly unimpressed by the display of force, by the confident posture of the man on the black horse. He was a man rooted to his own ground, as solid and unmovable as the stone foundations of his house. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, letting the silence stretch until it became a weapon in itself. A quiet refusal that was louder than any shout. The hired men grew uneasy under the weight of it. They were used to bluster and fear, not this unnerving stillness. Then, slowly, Silas brought his gaze back from the horizon and met Finch's eyes. His own were clear and steady, the color of slate. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, devoid of anger or fear, a simple statement of fact. No, the word was a stone dropped into a still pond. It was absolute, final. It offered no room for negotiation, no hint of compromise. It was a wall, and Finch had just run into it at full speed. A flicker of disbelief, then fury, crossed Finch's smooth face. He had been dismissed. He, a man of property and influence, had been denied by a dirt-poor rancher over a piece of human chattel. "I don't think you understand," Finch hissed, leaning forward in his saddle. "I have a legal claim. I will have the sheriff out here, or I will settle this myself. Right now." Silas did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply held Finch's gaze and spoke again, his words as clipped and hard as flint. "Get off my land." It was not a request. It was an order. His hand, which had been hanging loose at his side, came up and rested on the top of a sturdy fence post next to him. It was not a threatening gesture, not in the way a hand on a gun would be. It was a gesture of ownership, of connection. His hand was on his fence, on his land, and by extension, on everything and everyone within its borders. The message was clear. You are trespassing. You are not welcome here. You have no power here. The hired guns looked from Silas's calm, resolute face to Finch's sputtering rage. They were paid to intimidate, to bully, to be a show of force. They were not paid to die on some homesteader's dusty patch of ground for a matter of their employer's wounded pride. They saw in Silas's eyes a line that they were not willing to cross. One of them subtly shook his head at Finch, a barely perceptible motion, a vote of no confidence. Finch saw it. He saw the wavering of his hired muscle. He saw the absolute, unyielding certainty in Silas's stance, and he knew he had miscalculated. His power, so absolute in the transactional world of the town, was useless here. It had no purchase on a man who wanted nothing he could offer and feared nothing he could threaten. Humiliation warred with self-preservation on his face. He could escalate, force the confrontation, and risk the bloody, uncertain outcome, or he could retreat and salvage what was left of his authority. He chose retreat. With a final, venomous glare that promised future retribution, he jerked the reins of his horse, turning it so sharply that the animal reared in protest. "This isn't over, Blackwood," he spat, but the threat was hollow. The words of a man who had already lost. He spurred his horse and galloped away, his 2 men following behind, leaving a cloud of dust and the ringing silence of their defeat in their wake. Silas stood motionless until they were small figures on the horizon. Then he took his hand off the fence post. He turned and saw Alara still standing in the doorway, the dishcloth clutched in her white-knuckled fist, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and something else, something he had never seen there before, a fragile, dawning hope. He gave her a short, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and walked back into the cool, familiar shadows of the barn. The world had come to his door, and he had not bent. The immediate threat was gone, but a new tension settled over the ranch. The quiet aftermath of a battle won, but a war not yet over. Finch was a man who nursed a grudge, and his public humiliation would fester. Silas knew this. He moved about his chores with the same deliberate pace, but there was a new alertness in his posture, a way his eyes scanned the horizon more frequently. A stillness that was less about peace and more about readiness. He started keeping a rifle oiled and ready by the back door, a silent acknowledgement that his quiet world had been breached and might be breached again. Alara, too, was changed. The fear that had been her constant companion since her arrival had been replaced by a different kind of anxiety, a worry not for herself, but for the man who had stood for her. She watched him from the windows of the house, saw the new watchfulness in him, and understood that he had taken her burden as his own. The silent partnership between them had been forged in necessity. Now it was being tempered by shared risk. She wanted to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. Thank you felt too small, too hollow for what he had done. He had not just offered her a job or a roof. He had offered her his protection. He had stood as a shield between her and the world that sought to crush her. How could a few simple words possibly contain the weight of that? So she did not speak. Instead, she found another way to communicate, a language older than words. One evening, after Silas had come in from the fields and taken his meal in their usual silence, he went out onto the porch to sit and watch the twilight settle over the land. When he came back inside, he found something on the rough-hewn sill of the main room window. It was a small bird, carved from a piece of scrap pine he had left by the woodpile. It was no bigger than his thumb, but it was rendered with an astonishing, intricate detail. Every feather was delineated. Its head was cocked in a gesture of inquisitive life, its tiny form seeming ready to take flight. He picked it up. The wood was smooth and warm in his calloused palm. It was impossibly light. He knew, without having to ask, that it was her work. He looked at her, where she sat by the fire, her head bent over a piece of mending, her face illuminated by the soft, flickering light. She did not look up, but he saw the slight flush on her cheeks. This was her thank you. It was not a word of gratitude, which could be spoken and then forgotten. It was a thing of beauty, created from nothing, an act of grace and resilience. It was a piece of her spirit, a testament to the fact that even after everything she had endured, she could still create something delicate and fine. He closed his hand around the small bird, its fragile strength a mirror of the woman who had made it. He placed it carefully on the mantelpiece, where the firelight caught it and made it glow. It was a promise, he realized, a promise that beauty could exist even in the harshest of places, and that strength was not always loud. The seasons turned. Summer's relentless heat gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The threat of Finch receded, his humiliation apparently keeping him at bay, his power broken by a simple act of defiance witnessed by the very men he paid to enforce it. Wordlessly, the dynamic on the ranch shifted from one of employer and worker, protector and protected, to something quieter and more profound. It became a partnership. Alara no longer just tended the house and garden, she learned the rhythms of the ranch itself. She learned to milk the cow, to scatter feed for the chickens with a practiced flick of the wrist, to recognize the different calls of the birds that signaled a change in the weather. Silas, in turn, found himself yielding small pieces of his solitary domain. He taught her how to properly bank the fire at night, how to read the tracks of animals in the soft earth by the creek, how to saddle a horse. He spoke more in those weeks than he had in the previous 5 years. His words still clipped and practical, but now they were the words of a teacher, not just a man alone with his thoughts. One cool afternoon, they worked together to bring in the last of the harvest from her garden, their hands moving in a comfortable, synchronized rhythm. The silence between them was no longer tense or uncertain. It was easy, companionable, filled with the unspoken understanding that came from shared labor and mutual respect. She had become as much a part of the ranch as the fences he maintained, as the solid stone of the house. The lie that had brought her across an ocean had delivered her, by a cruel and crooked path, to a truth she could never have imagined. A home was not a place you were given. a promise whispered in a letter. It was a place you built, day by day, with your own 2 hands. It was the feeling of soil under your fingernails, the warmth of a fire on a cold night, the steady presence of another soul working quietly beside you. As they carried the last of the pumpkins to the root cellar, Silas paused and looked at her. Her face was smudged with dirt. Her hair had come loose from its braid, and her hands were rough and chapped from the work. She had never looked more beautiful. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she did not look away. A small smile touched her lips, a genuine, unguarded expression of peace. He found himself smiling back. It was a small, unfamiliar movement of his own facial muscles, but it felt as natural as breathing. The ranch was no longer just his, it was theirs. And in the quiet, shared space of that understanding, 2 solitary people, a man who had shut the world out, and a woman the world had tried to cast away, had finally found a place to belong. Sometimes, a life is built on a lie, a story told to us, or a story we tell ourselves, a promise of a distant shore where everything will be different, where we will be made new. We cross oceans of hope, only to find ourselves shipwrecked on the rocky coast of reality. The promises turn to dust in our mouths, and in those moments of disillusionment, we are faced with a choice. Do we cling to the wreckage of the lie, or do we look up and see the hard, unyielding truth of the land we stand on? Alara was promised a house with glass windows, but she found a home in a place of stone and rough-hewn timber. She was promised the ease of a merchant's wife, but she found her dignity in the hard-won calluses on her own hands. And Silas, a man who believed his peace was found in solitude, discovered that the strongest fences are not the ones that keep the world out, but the ones that create a safe space for someone else to stand beside you. True strength, the kind that endures, is not always loud. Sometimes it is as quiet as a man standing his ground. Sometimes it is as resilient as a woman planting a garden in a barren land. And sometimes the most profound truths are not spoken at all, but are built, day by day, in the shared silence of mutual work and quiet respect. We wanted to thank you for spending this time with us, for walking this dusty road and seeing a story not of grand heroes, but of the quiet, everyday courage that truly defines us. The world can be a harsh and unforgiving place, but it is also a place where a simple act of defiance, a shared meal, or a small carved bird can change everything. Have you ever found a truth in a place you least expected it? Let us know in the comments below. Your stories and your presence here mean the world to us. Until next time, take care of one another.